TV, now joined by Phil Odence, VP and GM of Black Duck Software. Phil, thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
Tell us about your specific role at Black Duck.
At Black Duck, well, most of the company's business is helping companies to manage their growing use of open source. My part of the company, called Black Duck On Demand, is involved with helping companies who are buying other companies who may not have been managing their open source very well.
Tell us about the panel that you were on today where you did discuss open source and the volume that you're seeing and the importance in M&A transactions.
Sure. Well, the panel was on the subject of cracking the code in technology, and it was specifically talking about this issue of open source, the two-edged sword of developers getting a lot of productivity about using freely available code, but on the other hand, not necessarily asking the questions that would lead them to mitigate the risks potentially associated with it.
I'm sorry, what are the questions that one should ask?
Well, first of all, what the license is. All software is by default covered by copyright law, and you can't use it without permission. A license represents the permission, and usually licenses have obligations that come along with them. So developers need to understand the licenses and the implications, and sometimes need to consult an attorney about that. Then what are the security vulnerabilities associated with that component? Another important area to ask about. And then how active is the community around the component? Is it something with a very vibrant community that may be finding and fixing problems before you even know about them? Or is it what I've heard some developers refer to as abandoned code, where nobody's really working on it anymore, so if there's a problem, you're on your own?
So how do you get answers to all of these questions? If you're a business owner out there developing a corporation, and you may not even be aware that you're using this.
Right. No, that's a good point, and I think what we've seen is a gap, luckily narrowing, between the management in companies and the developers who are getting their jobs done by using open source. I think what's important is for companies to first of all be aware that this is a thing, that this is the way software is being developed these days, and then to provide some guidance and some education for their developers so they simply know the questions to ask. I think a simple policy, a simple process to keep track of who's using what, and some education for the developers goes a long way, particularly in a smaller organization, towards mitigating the risk.
What would you say the most common misconception is among those who aren't well informed?
I suppose it's just that if it's there and usable, that you can use it without asking those questions. That the assumption is somebody who really doesn't know the nuances might think it's public domain, which has a very specific meaning, and that if it's there, you can use it and nobody will ever know. And the fact is that all of this software comes with a license and some of these other limitations.
And what is the future of open source?
Well, I think it's more and bigger. We've seen a monotonic trend of increase in the number of open source projects out there. It's now well over 1.5 million and continuing to grow. We've seen an increase from developers on average building 10% of their code out of open source to now being 50, even 80% on average. In a transaction, we tend to see around 30 to 40%. So I just think those trends will continue.
And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but let's just get into it a little bit more. You know, someone watching this may be thinking about potential liability with this.
Right.
So the best advice for someone who is trying to protect themselves against potential liabilities while using the software, what would you want them to know?
Well, I think on the sell side, any company that may be anticipating getting bought someday, even going for funding, should know that they're likely to get asked the questions about this. They're likely to be asked what open source is in the code, under what licenses, and what processes they're using to track that. I think on the buy side, buyers should make sure it's on their technical due diligence checklist. They should be asking what open source the seller is using, and go the step further to say, how do you know, to assess the credibility of it. If they're getting the question, if the answers back are, we'll have to get back to you on that, that's not a good sign. So simply asking the questions, and then bringing us in, I'm of course biased, but what we do is answer the questions definitively. We assess the code using Black Duck tools and come back with a list of here's what's in the code and here are the associated risks, and that's the ultimate protection.
The one thing we can say with certainty about technology is that it is just progressing at a breakneck speed. So how is your company preparing for what the future holds?
Well, I think what it says is that there's going to be more increasing need for our products and services, and we've been growing at a rapid rate and doing a pretty good job of keeping up with our customers.
That's all good news, Phil.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us
Oh,
today.
thank
We
you.
appreciate it.